I'm going to tell you two stories today. Both stories involve a person and a bridge. Both stories involve people in despair. And both stories have people who have a desire to end their life. But the most important part of these stories is how they end. And it's important to note they end differently. Now, I'm not a medical professional or a clinician of any sort. I'm just a person with a story of hope. Please meet my mother. Here's a picture of her. Her name was Lady. I was named after her. Like me, she grew up in the city of New Orleans. She married my father after graduating from Tulane. He was also from New Orleans. When she was 34, she had me, 4 years after having my brother. We grew up in the Garden District of New Orleans, and we had what many people thought was a perfect life. My mother was a ballerina and a model. She was beautiful. Our house was a happy one, or so I thought. This picture of Mom, I cherish. This picture was taken 35 years ago. 3 weeks after this picture was taken, my mother jumped off the Mississippi River Bridge and fell to the water below. They never found her. It was like she just disappeared. There was nights that I would sit at the top of the stairs of her old house and wait for her to come home. See, I thought if I could sit on those stairs long enough and will hard enough, my 9-year-old brain and heart would will her back. She didn't show up, and we never found her. There were witnesses that saw her jump. Now, I was never really told what happened. I found out at school from a friend how she died. But it was like, again, she had disappeared. And all I could think was, what had I done wrong? What had I done to make her want to leave me? I felt unlovable. I felt not enough. Clearly something was wrong with me if my mother was going to leave me. And pretty much the only question I ever have wanted to ask her was, what would have made you stay? Unfortunately, I couldn't ask her that at 9. I did not have those words. The day before she jumped off that bridge, she dropped me off at a friend's house for a sleepover. She gave me a tight hug. She whispered in my ear, "I love you." And if I could go back to that minute, I would have asked her to stay. But I didn't. It wasn't until my 20s that I started to even get therapy around the idea that my mother had died by suicide, to unpack the feelings that I had about this level of abandonment. Still now, in my 40s, I'm just really talking about it comfortably. Suicide has that much stigma. And 35 years ago, no one was talking about suicide. No one wanted to even talk about what had happened to my mother. It was as if the silence had killed her and was killing me, right? So let's turn this around a little bit. Now we're going to take away the story of my mother and put it aside. It's a very sad story. But I want to talk to you all about suicide in maybe your own lives. So please, I'm going to ask you a series of 3 questions, and for each question, please put your hand over your heart if it's true for you. So the first question is, do you know anyone who's died by suicide? A family member, a friend, a loved one? Maybe it's a work acquaintance. I want to point out that many of you have your hands over your heart, right? So you're not alone. This is something that is around. So the second question hinges on the first. Bring it to you personally. How many of you have ever felt lonely? I know, I felt lonely, for sure. And truthfully, loneliness is the common bond between us. You see, loneliness is something that all of us experience because we are humans wired for human connection. We're mammals. And when we don't have that level of connection, we feel sad and lonely. The Joyner model of suicide describes suicide as 3 things happening at the same time for someone to actually execute and plan a suicide. They have to feel like a burden to others. They have to feel hopeless or alone, which is also known as a lack of belonging. And the last is means by which they can actually carry out their plan. Right? So then let me talk about the third question I have for you. How many of us have felt anxious? 2 hands here for me. I felt anxious right before this speech. I carry a lot of sort of residual anxiety. Most of us do, right? There's this idea that we live in the age of anxiety. We make more decisions today than we did 100 years ago in a single lifetime. I'm going to say that again because it's pretty amazing. We make more decisions each day today than we did 100 years ago in a single lifetime. In short, our brains are tired. And you can probably see why. So let me tell you some statistics around suicide. You may know, okay, sort of like I brought it to you. Now you're feeling like, you understand the loneliness, the lack of belonging. But really, what are the stats? What's happening in the world? Every 40 seconds, someone dies by suicide in the world. In fact, by the time I finish this speech, 7 people will have died by suicide. Okay, in the US, 80 to 100 people die a day by suicide. That's the equivalent of 100 people on a jet airliner crashing every day in the US. Now just imagine if suicide got that level of publicity. Amazing, right? So out of those 100 people on that jet airline every day, 20 of them are American veterans. More American veterans have died by suicide stateside than in the wars they fought in. That is incredible. Now let's bring it to teens. Many of you are parents. We were all teens once, right? So in a CDC study in 2019 said that 19% of all teens, this is between ages 15 and 24, have had suicidal ideations at some point in the past year. 9% have carried out a suicide attempt. In fact, that may surprise you, but in the suicide prevention training that I've done to be a suicide prevention instructor, I learned that most all of us, by the time we reach middle age, have had some thoughts of disappearing as a solution to one of our problems at least once in our life. That doesn't mean we've had a plan, but it does mean we've wished ourselves away. It's a big problem, right? So it's hard not to take these stats and not feel hopeless. But I'm here today to tell you that you are the hope. You are the hope. Let me get to my second story. So my second story is about a man named Kevin Hines. Now here's a picture of him. And I was able to meet Kevin Hines in person. I'm working on a documentary about suicide, and in that documentary, it was really important for me to talk to someone who had a similar story to my mother's, so I could ask them the questions I couldn't ask her. Specifically, that question of what would have made you stay. And I found him. I found Kevin, and he is a miracle. I was able to meet Kevin at the base of the Golden Gate Bridge, and I spoke to him about his experience. Now, let me quickly tell you a little bit about Kevin. Kevin is the polar opposite of my mother. He's mixed race. He was 20 during his suicide attempt. My mother was in her 40s. He was adopted. He had been bullied in school. The stories he told me were horrible. And I asked Kevin, what would have made you stay? And first he said, well, let me tell you about what happened to me. See, Kevin wanted to die. And he, like my mother, found himself at the top of a bridge. This was the Golden Gate Bridge. He stood on that bridge and he waited for someone to tell him not to jump. And no one did. So Kevin jumped. He fell 200 feet at 75 miles per hour, hit the water, went 35 feet under the water, and a seal pushed him to the surface. He never lost consciousness. And he said there, when he was pushed to the surface, there was a rescuer waiting for him who said to him, "You're the only person I've pulled out of this water alive." Now, as Miracle's story goes on, he was brought to Marin General Hospital, where a surgeon who's not normally on staff and was there for an emergency surgery, who specializes in spinal reconstruction, and helped Kevin regain the ability to walk. And here Kevin is telling us his story of hope. So I asked, Kevin, what would have made you not jump off the bridge that day? And he said, I just needed someone to tell me not to. Amazing, right? So here I am to tell you that Kevin's here to show us that we can save other people's lives. Yes, you have the power to save a life. And you might be thinking, well, how? How do I have the power to save someone who's having suicidal ideations? The answer is so simple. It's just by asking them. You see, most people think that if they ask someone who's thinking about suicide, it will encourage it. Well, the opposite is true. Actually, science shows that if you ask somebody who's thinking of suicide, are you thinking of suicide? Are you thinking of harming yourself? You actually reduce their risk of suicide. See, the thing is, the thought of suicide for someone else has crossed your mind, chances are it has also crossed their mind, right? And is it tough to ask? It is so hard. It's totally scary. But I'm here to tell you that you would rather ask and be wrong than not ask and be right. You know, in suicide prevention training, we learned the concept of QPR. It's similar to CPR. So the idea is that you would ask somebody, are you thinking of harming yourself? Are you thinking of taking your own life? If the person says yes, what would you do? The best thing is to have a number handy of the suicide hotline or a local clinician in your area. You would say to that person, I know someone who can help you, and I'd like to take you to get help. That's the persuade part. And then the refer part would be doing everything in your power to bring that person to a person who can help them, a medical professional. You see, what I'm saying to you is that suicide is the most preventable form of death. And we have a duty to our community, to our friends, to our family, and to our loved ones to stop suicide by asking the questions that are difficult. If someone had asked my mother and looked in her eyes and said, "Are you thinking of suicide?" she might be alive today. And a little 9-year-old girl wouldn't have been waiting at the top of the stairs waiting for her mother to come home. And I think there's probably a lot of 9-year-old children, just like me, who can keep their parents, parents who can keep their children, wives that can keep their husbands, and friends that can keep their friends. All they have to do is ask a difficult question and save a life.